Hey guys, how's it going? This is Dylan. I got some requests to do an Oppenheimer review, so I'm gonna do a quick one. And by quick one, I don't mean that this review is gonna be short. It means I'm gonna try and edit it and get it out as quick as I can, hopefully by the end of the day. So I saw Oppenheimer last night with some friends. It was a good time. It was a good movie. Some people are saying that it's Christopher Nolan's Oscar movie. He did win an Oscar for Dunkirk, but this could be one of the ones we see at the next Oscars. And so I made a few bullet points about what I want to talk about because there is a lot to talk about. It's a 3-hour movie directed by Christopher Nolan with a budget of 100 million USD, and it's based on the book American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. So the first thing I want to talk about is how many celebrity actors are in this. Oh my god. 3 hours, and obviously we're following Cillian Murphy playing J. Robert Oppenheimer, who's the leading role. The movie's about him. I've heard that the screenplay written by Nolan was written in first person. So, this is the story about Oppenheimer. So besides Cillian Murphy, we have Florence Pugh, Robert Downey Jr., Emily Blunt, Jack Quaid, who plays the main character in The Boys, Rami Malek's in this, Matt Damon, Devin Bostick, who is in Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Josh Peck, that's Josh from Drake and Josh, Casey Affleck, Gary Oldman, Alex Wolff, who is in Old, Alden Ehrenreich, who's in Solo, Cocaine Bear, Hail Caesar. We've got Kenneth Branagh. So there's a lot of names. Okay, there's a lot of actors. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of extras. It's a big movie, and Nolan likes going for these blockbuster movies. Obviously, a lot of these A-list celebrities have decent screen time in the film. None of their roles are that big. The biggest roles are definitely Murphy first as the title character. Robert Downey Jr. is actually probably I don't know if it's the second biggest role, but a very prominent role in the film. And then Florence Pugh and Emily Blunt also pretty important. And a lot of these actors throughout the film get different moments of spotlight. So this is getting into spoiler territory. This is a 3-perspective story. The first perspective is us following Oppenheimer in linear chronological order, where he is recruited and he goes to get other scientists, and they all work on on the atomic bomb together. That's the first perspective. The second perspective is Oppenheimer in a witch trial, where his security clearance with the US government is up for renewal, but he's been set up, and he's being accused of being a communist. And so he's forced to retell the entire story from his perspective in this trial, this closed door trial. And then the final perspective is Robert Downey Jr.'s character is being nominated for a cabinet position, which would be the crowning political achievement of his career. And he is being interrogated by the senators about his dealings with Oppenheimer in the past, because this could be, something he gets declined for. So those are the 3 perspectives. Robert Downey Jr.'s perspective is entirely in black and white. So all of the scenes with him in it, even though his story narratively is the newest, is the most recent chronologically, his is the only one in black and white. Whereas whenever we focus on Oppenheimer and the creation of the atomic bomb, that's all in color. So that's an interesting twist, because usually we associate black and white with, the past. But also I'm curious if there's some moral connotations to it, that when you're living through like the events as they occur, it's kind of hard to see things, what's right and what's wrong and all of the details of a situation. But since Strauss's character, that's Robert Downey Jr., Louis Strauss, since Strauss is looking back on everything that happened, and with like this retrospective, he's able to say, oh, this was right and this was wrong and he should have known better, blah, 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 blah. So there's more of a black and white morality to it, but, we'll see that it's not that simple. So that's the three perspective story. Talking a little bit more about Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer. Cillian Murphy, great actor, definitely great in his role. I'm not really an expert on acting, but I think across the board, the acting from most of the actors and actresses was all great. There was only one scene, and it was Gary Oldman playing President Harry Truman. Truman in the scene is talking to Oppenheimer, and at the beginning of it, Truman's, I guess, a Southern president. I'm not a history buff, but Gary Oldman's playing Truman, who's the Southern president, and he's very jovial at first. And I thought that was a bit hammed, but that might be true to the actual person. But then the second part of that scene was great. Like, it suddenly gets darker, and the character of Truman, as Oppenheimer is leaving, says, "Don't never let that crybaby back in here," which is historically accurate to something that the real President Truman wrote about Oppenheimer after their meeting. Florence Pugh, who also plays a significant role, something that comes up is that she does full frontal at least 3 times in this film. It is very obvious. It definitely was deliberate. Technically, Cillian Murphy does full frontal too, but we don't see the lower half of either of these two. Florence Pugh's character is such a dominant role. It reminds me of something I heard about The Wolf of Wall Street, that Margot Robbie does also full frontal in her as her character in The Wolf of Wall Street. And I heard from somewhere that in an interview she said to Martin Scorsese that, like he had said, you don't have to be fully naked if you don't want to be. And she said, no, I think it's true to the character that she would be fully naked, and that this is about power because she is owning her body, she's owning her image, and the character is also dominating that scene by revealing everything. And I think for me, my interpretation is pretty similar. Like, in this, Florence Pugh's character always has a dominant relationship to Oppenheimer. We even get hints that kind of a little of a chauvinist. It's not like explicit, but there's a very clear scene where Cillian Murphy disregards and speaks over his brother's love interest at that time, like completely disregarding her because she's presumably a woman, or he doesn't like her personality. But in contrast to that, Florence Pugh's character is always telling Oppenheimer what to do. Oppenheimer brings her flowers and she always throws them out and says, "I hate flowers." She's kind of back and forth, and she has conflicted psychological state, but at the same time, her character is the one in charge. And unfortunately, she takes her life, which is, I assume, history. But I just wanted to speak to the fact that the full frontal could be a part of that, or it just could be just cause. I don't know. Speaking to the length of this film, 3 hours long, there are 2 whole movies in this one film. The first half, I assume it's an even split, like an hour and a half, an hour and a half. The first hour and a half film is Oppenheimer, early life, coming to the US, starting quantum theory, academic field, gets recruited to be the director of the Manhattan Project as World War II is in swing. And then they test the bomb, they make the bomb is dropped on Japan. The second half of the film, which includes all of the narration and the perspective, like the retrospectives from Oppenheimer and from Lewis Strauss, that is more of a courtroom interrogation film, right? That's the second movie that exists in this one movie. The last hour and a half or so is just about how Oppenheimer was treated and looked at and hunted, basically. How Oppenheimer was hunted post World War II and in the midst of the Cold War, because suddenly they've switched from the US versus the Nazis to the US versus their former ally, the Soviets. And you really feel that switch. Like, even during the first hour and a half when they're building the bomb, there's always a concern about Soviet spies, about even though they're allies, the US hates communists and the Communist Party, and there's always this hunt. So when Oppenheimer becomes the father of the atomic bomb and the most famous man in the world following its creation, some people who really hate him, including Louis Strauss, set out on a hunt and to ruin his image, to ruin his career after the fact, and really hound him for having ties to the Communist Party during his time, or in his earlier life. So because of this double feature in Oppenheimer, there's very quick pacing. The scenes are straight and to the point. There's not much waiting around or pretty imagery. It's just plot to plot to plot. And I think that's one of the movie's strengths, actually, because when it comes down to it, most of it really is just the scientists talking to each other, or characters talking to each other about what needs to be done. And obviously you're not going to see the experimentation or what's actually going on day to day, because this whole thing took 3 years to make the bomb. So what captures your attention and keeps you going is, one, the music, which was really great, and the sound design, but then also this really quick pacing between plot points in the scene. Another thing about the pacing that, and this is a slight maybe criticism, you never really get a sense of the rush against the Nazi scientists. There's a line in both the trailer and the film where Matt Damon's character says they have a 12-month head start on us, referring to the Nazis. And then Oppenheimer says it's actually 18 because he knows Heisenberg, the guy who's in charge of their program. But their one saving grace could be that Hitler considers this science to be Jewish science, and so they might not get all the funding they need. But when they're actually building the bomb, although there is certainly this race against the US government in a way, because the US government needs results, the US military needs results by a certain time, in this case, the Potsdam Conference, where they are going to discuss it with their Soviet allies for the first time. They don't bring the arms race with the Nazis up again in the film. So, you get that tidbit, that setup, that's really great. And then also the race to test the device before the Potsdam Conference, that's great. But you don't get the kind of back and forth. And obviously the movie has to be economical and it's focused on Oppenheimer. It doesn't need to jump to show Heisenberg also doing this exact same thing in Nazi Germany. But that is something that is missing from this race. And similar to that, you also don't see the development of the H-bomb, because that's not Oppenheimer's story. That another scientist kind of takes up that, and then that begins the Cold War arms race with the Soviets. That's a whole nother story as well. But you never see the US or Oppenheimer versus another country. It's always Oppenheimer versus either himself, the other scientists, the US government, the US military, etc. And then another point about the sound. There were actually quite a few moments, such as the explosion scene, where the sound actually gives you a really intense, a really loud jump scare. And it's funny because they do it like 3 times in a row at a time, and it happens a few times because the explosion, there's this big swell of music, this big lead up to the scene where they're finally going to test the bomb, for example. And then there's silence when it goes off, and there's just the visual majesty of the explosion that was done practically, and it's really pretty. And then all of a sudden, bang, and they do that 3 times in a row. So that's something that kind of almost veers into horror elements for this film. Something that's been really hyped up in the marketing has been the practical effects, that Christopher Nolan doesn't like using CG or CGI. And so a lot of the shots that you can see in the trailer, where there's the huge explosion of the test, but then also smaller effects where Oppenheimer's kind of visualizing quantum theory in his head. Those are all mostly practical. They might be touched up in post, but they are, for the most part, it's all practical. For me personally, I think it's interesting visually, but I don't think that's the best part of the movie. Obviously, it's just for the visual aesthetic of it. There's no plot relevance other than the explosion itself. But then even then, you could argue, oh, well, they could just say the explosion happened and the plot could keep going. So, that's for some people. It's not for me necessarily. So I don't have much to say about that. Another point about the practical effects, I obviously, because since they are practical, there's not as much space you can take with the camera. You kind of have to get close in. One of the shots was a marble shot, and it's supposed to look like ginormous, like a planet sized. And obviously they have to really zoom in on that. And so something you can feel with all of the practical shots, including the big explosion where they test it, the camera framing of it is very not close. It's medium. It doesn't zoom out to give you the whole perspective, and that could be Christopher Nolan's vision for it. But especially in the beginning, when you see the spinning things and the particles and everything in Oppenheimer's imagination, like repeatedly, you see it repeatedly. So like this is why it sticks out to me. All of those shots are pretty tight, and it feels kind of constrained. And I don't think that's necessarily purposeful to adding to the stories. To me, it seems more like, oh, well, we're doing this practically. We can only film it this certain way. And you kind of feel that. But that's a really minor issue, if an issue at all. Something that was fun was that they had Einstein in the film, which is obviously historically relevant. But that was fun to see, and Einstein's interactions and Einstein's lines. There's definitely moments of humor with a few of the characters. Some of the characters are serious the whole time. A few of the characters have comedic moments, such as Einstein, such as Edward Teller, played by Benny Safdie. But it's mostly a dramatic film. Another great sequence that I just want to mention is there's a speech scene following the successful test of the bomb, following the dropping of the bomb, that Oppenheimer is kind of forced to give because he's the director, to all of the scientists. And we clearly see a lot of what Oppenheimer is overwhelmed by, the grief that he feels and responsibility for creating such a destructive weapon. We see very clever usage of these people celebrating the dropping of the bomb, but it's so similar to victims of the bomb that Oppenheimer is haunted by it, and it's a very chilling use of two such contrasting environments where people are celebrating, they're drinking, they're laughing, they're cheering, but then the opposite end to that is those same people being viewed from Oppenheimer's perspective as crying, as yelling in pain, as vomiting from the nuclear radiation after effects. It was a really cool scene, and he steps in a corpse, a burnt up corpse, a charred corpse. That was really cool. Yeah, so that's hitting most all of the points I wanted to talk about. Maybe I've forgotten something. The last thing that I'll end on is just how human focused this film was, and the dilemma and the moral question and the messaging, because I'm not entirely sure yet. I don't think I've sat down long enough to think about it, but I think that's fun for whoever watches it to think about on their own. You know, there's a lot of question of, is it right to build these weapons of mass destruction? That's something that Oppenheimer and all of the scientists struggle with even before they sign on to the Manhattan Project, because they know that when it's made, you can't unmake it. And there's also discussion of, are they the ones responsible for the bloodshed that occurs afterwards, or is it the governments that use it however they like? And that kind of goes back and forth throughout the film. And at the very end, the final scene between Oppenheimer and Einstein, which was teased earlier in the film, but it's not revealed what they talk about until the end. Oppenheimer and Einstein talk about how at one point during the project, there was concern that the reaction from the atomic bomb might ignite the atmosphere and cause the end of the world. And it turned out that that wasn't the case, but Oppenheimer leaves Einstein with, but I still think we've caused the destruction of the world, referencing the fact that now that atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs are being made at the time of the film and then are made, there's no going back. And humanity has kind of doomed itself with these weapons. And that was a very poignant scene to end on. Very, very last thing. Is this film rewatchable? I'm not sure. 3 hours long. You know, this isn't that... I don't think there's much you'd get from it on a second watch. I mean, I'm sure there's obviously things you're going to notice, but it's a long time commitment. It's a historical film. It's not like history changes. For example, something that comes to mind is that Dunkirk, you know, you would rewatch it because there's not much dialogue. It's mostly action throughout, and you want to relive that. I can see people wanting to relive Oppenheimer for the sound and the driving pace and the story beats. But me personally, probably not going to rewatch this. Great film. Not the best of all time. Not great film. Not my favorite film, but definitely a great film. And Christopher Nolan, obviously a genius, very talented filmmaker. And yeah, that's all I got to say about Oppenheimer.